And if you look on your program, that's Sophia Fifner. She's been an advocate for women and girls for over 15 years. She served as a change agent for sexual assault and civic engagement issues. To fulfill this mission, Sophia serves on the Survivor Advisory Council of the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, the Board of Directors of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, and is an alumna of the Joanne Davidson Leadership Institute and a graduate of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs New Leadership Program. So please give a warm welcome for our keynote speaker this evening, or this morning, Ms. Sophia Fifner.
All right, I hope, can everyone hear me? Is my mic on? Okay. Well, foremost, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I can't tell you how honored I am to stand in front of each of you. The work that you do in our community, as Melissa shared, just like teachers, is oftentimes not thanked. So thank you. Because of you, so many families can go home at night, and we appreciate you. Now, I'm sure as first responders, you probably hear quite a few stories, because crime doesn't stop during a pandemic. And I'm sorry to share today another challenging story. At 17, I was raped. And I experienced the one crime that no family wants to bear witness to. But before I tell you about my rape and that experience, I want to share a little bit about my family and who I am. I am a first-generation American. My parents immigrated from Jamaica in the 1970s for the pure opportunity for a better life. They wanted to get an education, they wanted to raise a family here in the United States, and they did exactly that. After immigrating to the Bronx, they found themselves in a small, suburban, rural community in Ohio, and that's where I spent the majority of my childhood. And to tell you a little bit about my small town, it was a type of town where on Friday nights, families go to football games and wear the town's colors. During the summer, I spent countless hours in the creek, catching crawdads, picking mulberries, not washing them before I ate them. That was probably a terrible idea. Playing Monopoly, going to the pool. And on Sundays, my family and I went to church. I grew up in a very religious household. So much so, if any of you visit my parents' house, they have 104.9 broadcast outside of their home. Thankfully, none of their neighbors have complained. But quite frankly, they not only have the music broadcasted, but we were the type of family that went to church not only on Sunday morning, but Sunday evening and Wednesday as well. My junior year of high school, I had a group of friends who called me and said, hey, there's a party, we should all go. And I thought, okay, that sounds good. It was a friend of a friend of a friend. And as a junior, quite frankly, I didn't really care as long as my friends said, hey, this is a good opportunity to connect with others. So we hopped in a car and went. We drove to a nondescript neighborhood with split-level homes. And I remember walking into the house, white house, black shutters. And walking in, there were a few people there. I didn't know who they were, but I felt safe because I was with my friends. And while I didn't know anybody, I really didn't think anything was going to happen. Now, at this event, I drank way too much. We were playing card games, there was a lot of liquor, and I was exhausted. So I decided that I would walk down to the basement, and I remember how it smelled. It was like a lot of older homes, a little damp, but there was a stack of mattresses in the corner. It was pitch black, and I blacked out. I didn't wake up until I felt someone inside of me. And I think that when you think of survivors of rape, you oftentimes assume that they're going to kick, they're going to yell, they're going to come to with Olympic precision, they're going to push their rapists off of them. But my reaction was the reaction of many. I froze. I don't know if any of you know what it's like to feel like life has literally left your body. But as I felt that someone was attacking my body, I felt like I was buried under a mountain of cement. But he finished, I came to, and I ran up the stairs. And when I started to talk about what happened to me, to be honest with you, I didn't have words to describe what happened to me. Because in my family, we didn't talk about sex. We certainly did not talk about rape. So as I'm describing what just happened, my friends who were the same age as me didn't quite know what to say either. They asked, "Are you sure? Are you sure that happened?" And for many of you who have worked with survivors, we're sure. I called a friend, and I was so thankful for her bravery because she drove me to the local hospital to complete a SANE kit. The nurses found sperm in me. I submitted my statement to the 2 detectives that were there to retell my story again to my parents, and I was, quite frankly, terrified. Because as a child, I was a rule follower. I wasn't the best student, but I got an honor roll. I followed rules, and I went to church 3 times a week. So having to tell a story about my activities for that night, and then on top of that, this scenario that I didn't quite have words for 3 times, it was one of the most traumatic experiences I had ever lived through. But what I didn't realize was that the trauma and the experience of rape wasn't the worst crime that I was going to experience. A few weeks later, the detectives called my parents, and they shared that my accuser, well, he was going to take a polygraph test because he shared that he never met me, doesn't know who I am, and that I'm lying. And my parents, wanting to be good Americans, wanting to be good citizens, if the detectives say, "Hey, you should take a polygraph test," they're going to say, "Sure." So my parents drove me to a building on the west side of town to take a polygraph test. And I remember walking into the floor where this test was going to be administered. And I walked through, there was cubicles, and then on the very far wall was the glass windows, nondescript, lots of filing cabinets. I sat down, the polygraph test was here to my left. A trooper standing in front of me began to ask me questions. She wanted to know what happened. So again, I told my story over. And she shared with me that just because I was drinking and just because I woke up to somebody that I didn't recognize, that was not rape. In fact, she had had many experiences in college where she woke up to men that she didn't know, and just because that happened, that was not rape. And unless I rewrote my statement, she was not going to administer the test. Now, I told you I grew up in a religious household, and one of the things that I value is honesty. And the last thing I was going to do, even at 17, was to write something that wasn't true. I also, by then, knew the statistics around rape. Foremost, oftentimes it's somebody that you know. My rapist was a stranger. Oftentimes it's somebody of the same race. My rapist was somebody from a different race. As a black girl living in a rural community in Ohio, I also knew I'm a black girl with 2 parents who to this day get nervous when they have to speak in public because of how strong their accents are. Who is going to believe me if this trooper didn't believe me, and the history of who typically gets raped doesn't align with my story? So I left. And I'd like to say that the rape was the most atrocious crime that I experienced, but the worst crime was not being believed. It was the crime of indifference. Now I'm here today, so I lived, but I can share with you that for 15 years, I lived a caged life. The experiences that many have connecting with one another were challenging for me. I remember my first week at Miami University. I was so excited. I had a roommate, and to tell you about the type of roommate I was, I had my posters picked out, Disney princesses, I had pink bedding, I was so excited. I just wanted to make new friends, and my roommate invited me to a party. And I was like, oh, sure, yeah, I'll go. I can go to a party. I remember walking into this house, and when you walked in, the smell of beer just hit me. And I was following her, around the house, and we ended up going towards the basement. There were beer cans everywhere. And I broke down. I had a panic attack. I didn't know what to do. How do you explain that to somebody that you've only known for 3 days? Hi, I'm a survivor of rape, and I have panic attacks when there are certain things that trigger me. As a professional, my first job was walking the halls of Capitol Hill. I spent a career in fundraising and philanthropy, and oftentimes I have to go to events. And as adults, oftentimes evening events include alcohol. How do you tell your boss, I'm sorry, I need to take 30 minutes? Because something happened today where I knew I was going to be in a room with alcohol, and I had a panic attack. What's worse? How do you tell your husband that in the most intimate of moments, that something just happened, a touch, the mood in the room, where you have a flashback, and you just can't? That's the life I lived for 15 years as a survivor of rape. And quite frankly, it wasn't until November 9th, 2016, that I realized my life needed to change, and change for good. Now, if any of you remember the environment in 2016, for some, I'm sure it's politics as usual. But for me, it was a really challenging year. First, I was pregnant with my first child, and I wanted to make sure I was doing everything I could to keep her safe. But the world that I lived in, whether it be within my family or what I was watching on television, it was a world that lacked empathy. Every day there was a news story that had a negative perception of immigrants, a news story about a derogatory comment about women, a news story about how survivors of sexual assault doesn't matter. So by the time I came home with my daughter Caroline and was holding her in her soft yellow, brand new nursery, I cracked. And I remember this combination of a feeling of complete rage and optimism hitting my gut. And I realized, and I made a promise to Caroline, that I would no longer be silent, and that I would embrace my voice. I would no longer not tell my story and share my experience, because I wanted to make sure that Caroline grows up in a community that's empathetic, that encourages people to take a moment to walk in somebody else's shoe. So perhaps when they're saying things that might be offensive, that might drive wedges, that instead we'd have a community that brings people together. So from that moment, I decided that I was going to be brave, I was going to be bold, and I was going to embrace my voice. Now, bold. I realize I'm sitting in front of a group of individuals who are first responders and police officers, so this probably wasn't the best idea. But I wanted to have a conversation. Our country just went through a pretty tumultuous election cycle. And I say that while having family members and close friends on both sides of the aisle. I wanted to bring people together. So a friend of mine who also likes to talk about a lot of serious issues that matter, well, we posted something on Facebook and invited complete strangers to my house, to my living room, to do exactly that. We called it Salon Lab, and it was a group of anywhere between 8 to 20 women with a glass of wine, and we talk about issues like Black Lives Matter. We talk about issues like gun violence. We talk about issues like Marsy's Law, because I wanted to create a space where if you are a Democrat, you could understand a Republican. If you're a Republican, you could understand a Democrat, and that we could have a foundation of empathy to come together. And those bold conversations, honestly, every single person that participated took away something, that we have more in common than anything else. I was brave. So I shared with you that I started my career on Capitol Hill. So I know how a bill becomes a law. I know how to advocate on behalf of others. I spent an entire decade in the philanthropic world asking for people for support, yet I had never done that for survivors like myself. Well, on November 9th, 2016, that changed. I started to volunteer with organizations like RAIN, like the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, like the Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center, organizations that I know individuals in this audience also volunteer with as well. Because I wanted to make sure as a survivor, as somebody who understands how to fundraise, how to ask for others for support, that I was using those skills for good. And then last, I embraced my voice. Now, when I say that, I think oftentimes, or at least for me, I would envision somebody who becomes very loud, perhaps chains themselves to a tree with a sign. But to me, embracing your voice doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be loud to be heard. But I needed to take one step further. I needed to ask for help. So I spent several years working with a therapist because I no longer wanted to cry when I told my story. I wanted to be able to leverage my voice as loudly as I could and to make it through a speech like the speech today without welling up with tears. So we went through a series of therapy. I'm sure many of you have been in therapy too, where you take deep breaths, where you visualize a neutral place that brings you joy. And it was incredibly beneficial because 5 years ago, I would not be able to stand on this stage. Now, I'd like to invite you to join me in creating a world of empathy. But before I wrap up, I have one more story to share. And that is the story of Officer Utt. I don't know if any of you know Officer Utt with the Gahanna Police Department. But he changed my life. On this journey of trying to embrace my voice and finding resolution for my trauma, for me that also meant seeking justice. I wanted to know what options I had as a survivor of rape, whether it be a criminal avenue or civic avenue. I needed to find out what happened, what information was in my records, and I knew that that couldn't just take place over the phone. I needed to go to the place where I had first reported my crime. So I made an appointment with Officer Utt to meet him, to go over some of the records that I had, to talk about my story. And I remember I left work, I was driving in my car, clutching my steering wheel, because I knew I was going to have a difficult conversation, and quite frankly, I was really worried on if I was going to be believed. I I made it to the parking lot. I got there early because I knew I'd probably need to take a few deep breaths. I sat there in my car, trying my best to hold it together. Panic attack. And for those of you who wear makeup, the last thing you want is mascara running down your face. So doing the eye dab in my car, trying to do everything I can to make sure that my eyes aren't bloodshot red when I walk through those doors to meet with the officer. Make sure I'm okay, and I walk through. And I am so thankful that Officer Utz showed up with empathy that day. And I realize that in your line of work, you deal with so many emergencies. You have to make quick decisions. There are a lot of things going on. But he walked in and took a moment to understand what it would be like to walk in my shoes. He was bold. He held my hand. He was incredibly patient as I shared with him what my goals were, what information I was looking to find. He was brave, passed me a Kleenex. I cried again while telling my story. And he embraced his voice. He said, "I believe you. I believe you." I don't think he realized in the moment how transformational those words were for me as a survivor, to hear "I believe you" from someone in uniform, because I spent the majority of my life not being believed. So, if I leave one thing with you today, I hope that we can create a space of more kindness and empathy. And I invite you to be bold, to be brave, and to embrace your voice. Thank you.